Hi everybody, I'm Richard Owen, the CEO of Agilysis. And today I'm going to be talking about COVID-19 and how it's impacted upon road safety and what the implications are going forwards. We're going to have a look at some data that's been made available. We're going to look at some traffic information and find out a little bit about how people's behaviour changed on the roads. Look at the roads themselves, see how they changed during the pandemic. Then reflect on whether there's anything we can learn already about any changes in casualties, as well as any changes in public attitudes. Then finally, I'm going to show some research that we've carried out into the impact on road safety delivery. So I'm going to start with a nice chart here. This is information that's been published by the Department for Transport every week during the pandemic. The three lines that you can see on here correspond to cars, light commercial vehicles and heavy goods vehicles. The way that they've measured this is by creating an index against the first week in February. So you do see some fluctuations there. You can see the big drop that happened after the 23rd of March. We had a huge decrease in the number of cars and light goods vehicles, almost down to about 20% of those levels that we saw at the beginning of February. HGVs didn't decrease as much, obviously carrying out essential work, keeping supermarkets filled with food, etc. You can see how the pickup happened gradually throughout April and May and then into June. And then as we get into the summer period, we're getting close to where the normal levels would be, certainly at the weekends. Those sharp spikes upwards that you can see correspond to weekends. And the dips still correspond to weekdays. So that's definitely showing that weekday traffic is much more suppressed than weekend traffic is. Now we've only got information to the about middle of October here, so you can't see any impact of any local lockdowns on here. There's a slight downward trend for cars that you can see towards the end there, but we really need more information and it probably needs to be localised. This is just national data. So what happened on other forms of transport? Well, you can see we've got some cycling data here. These are the light blue jaggedy lines that are going on there. The way that they collected that data was actually using mobile phone data to estimate whether people were cycling or not. There isn't a national network of cycle counters that can be used. So you can see that really big increases associated with that great weather that we had in April and May. So lots more people out there cycling. Then you can see the national rail figure, which really does plunge. This is taken from ticket prices and is actually matched to the previous year's figure. So you can see that this is nowhere near recovered back to where it was before. So is this pushing more people onto bikes? Is it making people walk more? We don't have any information about walking, unfortunately. So we can see through the data that's been published that there are some definite changes, and most of you will have seen these when you're out and about on the road yourself. So clearly, we're not having as many of these. Traffic jams, not necessarily a thing of the past, but with traffic figures significantly reduced even now, this means that we're less likely to have more traffic on the roads, and that's going to have an impact on some of our other data sets. We're not seeing as many people on public transport, especially things like the tube. It's just not an attractive environment, and people are being told to work from home if they can do so efficiently. What we are seeing more of, though, Amazon Prime. We're getting a lot more deliveries done to our home now, and this may be seen with increased van traffic on our roads. And we're seeing more people like this. Not necessarily Boris on a bike, but certainly people out cycling. I think most of us working in road safety would see that as a really good thing. Shame he's not wearing a helmet though. So what about behaviour? Well, very soon after the 23rd of March, there were reports of vehicles being detected at high speeds. This is some information from an FOI request carried out by the RAC, showing some really, really high speeds, 151, 140 on motorways and dual carriageways, a crazy 134 and a 40 limit in North London, and then even in urban areas such as Manchester, 70 miles per hour. So earlier on in the year, we carried out a survey in association with some other local authorities. We put out a help request through the RSGB Champions Network to analysts out there to see if they had any traffic survey data that would help us try and explain this in a little bit more detail. So we analysed 91 traffic surveys from 4 different local authorities, so a mixture of rural and urban authorities in England. So we looked at different types of roads, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then tried to look at the trends for all drivers. The paper was officially published in July and is still available on our website. In brief though, this is what we saw. This is the same kind of daily flow information that we saw from the DFT data just for April and then into May. And you can see that there were reductions in the number of vehicles driving on our roads in all different speed limits. What we then did is we had a look at the average percentage of vehicles that were over the speed limit before and after lockdown. Now you can already see that, for example, on the blue line, which is 60 mph limits, compliance was pretty good. But that did increase quite significantly in terms of percentages after lockdown. Compliance in 30 limits isn't as good. You're only looking at about 30% in the roads that we were looking at before lockdown, and that's risen up to around 40%. But it's still significant across all of the limits that there have been lower levels of compliance. Now we can start to have a look at those vehicles that were driving significantly above the limit. So these are drivers that were more than 15 miles an hour above the limit. Now you can see that percentages are quite small here. Even that biggest peak there is only showing 4% of drivers, but 4% of drivers travelling at 15 miles an hour above the speed limit. That's crazy. And these peaks tend to associate themselves with weekends as well. So there's definitely some kind of behaviour that's going on there where people are choosing to drive above the speed limit, increasing their average speed, and increasing these extreme speeds. And again, in terms of the percentage rises, some of those were highest on the rural roads. Now, within the paper, you can see all of the details associated with it. So we've got all of these individual figures, but it was the 60 mph limits, those rural roads, and some 50s as well, where we were most concerned about the percentage change in terms of speeders. So there's definitely a strong correlation there between the reduction in flows and increases in speed across all of the metrics. Definitely had it higher on the 60 mph roads there, and we think that this demonstrates the importance of continued targeted enforcement. We do know through various newspaper articles that some police forces reduce the level of enforcement during a lockdown. And the thing that I'd say is, if this situation does rise again, we do need to seriously consider whether there is targeted enforcement on the roads where we know that people are exhibiting these really poor driving behaviours. Now, there is some early casualty data from some of the local authorities that we work with to indicate that speed choice may be influencing casualty severity, showing that we haven't seen as big a reduction in care size that we might have expected. But it's a little bit too soon to be sure. I'm going to talk a little bit about casualty data in a moment. So what's happened on the roads then? Well, we've had the drop in traffic, but that's been, concerns about public transport risk, so leading to more cycling and walking. So there's several different things that are going on here. You've got people who aren't travelling at all, and then people who are just really very scared about using public transport. Grant Shapps there, was leading many of the briefings back in April and May, as I'm sure you remember, and he said at the time that local authorities should make significant changes to their road layouts to give more space to cyclists and pedestrians. So it's something that a lot of people would really encourage. New guidance was issued to authorities on reallocating road space, and £250 million was made available as a part of the Emergency Active Travel Fund Phase 1. Even more funding is available in Phase 2. So, we recognise that the way that people wanted to move was changing, so we needed to give them more space, and then we needed to give each other more space. We all needed 2 metres, and this would cause some issues in busy town centres. So let's look at the kinds of things that happened. One of the really popular things, at least initially, were pop-up cycling facilities. So this is something that the Department for Transport were really touting as a good way of quickly reallocating road space. So they're talking about, using light segregation features such as plastic wands, or converting traffic lanes into temporary cycle lanes, and suspending parking bays wherever necessary. One thing they were really keen on, though, was making sure that facilities were segregated as far as possible. So with physical measures, not just paint on the roads. It's been very clear in a number of briefings from people from the Department for Transport that they see, this forthcoming cycling revolution as something that is about separated cycle facilities and not just paint on the roads. So here's an ideal example of what segregation would look like. So this is some light segregation with a nice wide cycle path there, and then some bollards separating it to give everybody a good sense of security there. And that's one of the things that the DFT were really keen on, that if we're going to get new cyclists here, they want to feel that they're on a separate piece of infrastructure, so they're going to carry on doing it, and they're not just catapulted onto the road with a thin bit of paint between them and vehicles travelling very quickly. One of the other things that DFT were keen to see was encouraging cycling and walking to school. So introduction of school streets. So these have been pioneered in London, but the idea is that you can just close down streets depending on their nature if they're really near a school, and it could be much more effective at encouraging walking and cycling. Hopefully, if people aren't going to be getting in their cars and just dropping them off at the end of the closed street. And the other thing as well were modal filters, also known as filtered permeability, which wasn't a phrase that I knew before 2020, which is about closing roads to motor traffic. So not closing the road entirely, but just making it effectively a series of dead ends. I've got some pictures of this one in a second. So here's the school streets schemes that you might tend to see in place, entirely closed off with temporary barriers there. And then only access for pedestrians and cyclists to help them get to school. In terms of this filtered permeability, these are the kinds of examples. So these are ones that come from the London Cycling Design Standards, and you can see that you've just closed the end of the road individually there, but you can still get bikes through. And the one on the bottom right hand corner is just a change in road layout, so you can still get through that gateway feature, but it just makes it harder for you to do it as a motorist, whereas the cyclists have priority that goes through. So we've seen some changes on the roads, and there's many more to come, I'm sure. Let's have a look at whether there's any information that we can get to tell us about whether the changes that have happened so far have resulted in a reduction in casualties. Well, unfortunately, the Department for Transport don't publish their data for the first 6 months until probably around the end of November, beginning of December. So we might be waiting a little while to see that. But analysis undertaken at local levels has indicated large reductions in collisions and casualties. I've spoken to people again through the Champions Network, seeing 60–70% reductions in collisions, but that's not necessarily been matched by the number of KSI casualties. Other countries have published some data. So France has an excellent National Road Safety Observatory where they publish updated figures on a very regular basis. So you can see some information here about the number of accidents that took place in 2019 versus the number that took place in 2020. So you see that really huge drop in April. They locked down slightly earlier than us in March, as you may recall, so that's why they saw the bigger drop then. But then, coming back to July, August, September, figures more or less the same, certainly in terms of the number of accidents. Now in July, the ETSC published one of their PIN briefings, which was looking at the impact of COVID-19 lockdowns on road deaths across Europe in 2020. Now the UK were asked to provide information on this, but of course, as I've already mentioned, it wasn't available. But what they showed is that across those EU 25 countries, there was a really significant decrease in the number of deaths, about 36% decrease in the number of deaths. But if we saw traffic levels dropping, in the 50s, 60s and 70%, that tends to show you that it's not exactly been equal, has it? So individual countries, so I sat on a few seminars on this with other analysts across Europe. The Netherlands have reported rises in injuries in young drivers. So they've found that within their accident data that's very heavily associated with speeding or reckless driving. The phrase used again was COVID-idiots, people behaving unusually during the coronavirus pandemic, and they thought that that was something that they were starting to see in young drivers. France showed larger reductions among older drivers, which they think was associated to older drivers more likely to be shielding, not going out as much, so not being as injured as much on the roads. Now across the European Union, some estimates have been made. So this is looking at the data through to the end of August, and what you can see is that they've indexed against a 3-year baseline, so 2017 to 2019, and show what happened in any of the individual months to see what those decreases in deaths would look like. And you can see the figures there, really quite strong from March through to June, and then going up a little bit in July and August, but not returning to the same kind of levels that we'd seen in previous years. And they reckon that across the whole of Europe, that's going to be a saving of around 2,500 lives so far. Now, I've analysed the UK data, and I think that if we applied that, maybe assuming that you continue with that 15% reduction for the rest of the months this year, could be more, then that would mean that we'd have a total of 1,442 road deaths, which, obviously every death's a tragedy, but it would definitely be the lowest number that we've seen recorded in the UK. That's a drop of 335 fatalities on the 3-year average. So how have public attitudes changed during the pandemic? Well, if you cast your minds back to April and May, you remember lots of people hopefully enjoyed more walking and cycling for leisure purposes. As part of your daily exercise, only allowed out once a day, you had to make the most of it. Got to see many more people, many more of your neighbours. The footpaths and cycle paths were really busy, I seem to remember. But is this going to result in a longer term change to our behaviour? Are we just going to end up back on our cars or back in public transport? Well, we can find out a little bit about that through the National Travel Attitude Study. So this is a new survey that's come off the back of the normal National Travel Survey carried out by the Department for Transport. So it started last year, and previous topics have included, information about what people think about speed cameras, airport taxes, anything that the DfT are interested in hearing the public's opinion about. Now, Wave 4, which is the one that looked at COVID-19, was released back in October. And so the information was collected during May to June, so you can see how the data collection aligns with the various lockdown measures on that diagram at the bottom of the screen there. So the final version is actually going to come in January, which will have double the number of responses, which will give the researchers much more confidence about what it was that had happened. It really is a fascinating report, and I've pulled out a few things here that I think are most relevant to us. So comparing now to before, there was a confirmed case of coronavirus. How much more are you using the following modes? So you really see cycling, walking, 38% saying that they're cycling more, 39% saying that they're walking more. Some less, perhaps those that are restricted in going out. But then, the changes for all other form of transports are really significant. So again, this was towards the end of that initial lockdown phase. But interestingly, 94% thought that it was likely they would continue to cycle and walk more once travel restrictions were removed. And this could really be a significant step change for us in the UK in terms of our modal shift, getting more people cycling and walking and getting people out of their cars. So many benefits, not only for congestion, for pollution, but for our own health and well-being, of course. Now, we're going to need to wait a little while for the census data to come out, but it is still taking place, hopefully. Sunday, the 21st of March, 2021 is Census Day, and that's an opportunity to find out much, much more about commuting patterns. The map that you can see at the bottom there is Newbury and Thatcham, and as well as the roads, which you can see coloured in green according to the level of traffic that they've got on them, you've got the areas coloured in blue. And that's information that comes from census data, which tells us about the percentage of people within those areas that have cycle commutes. So they've got this information for walking, for using public transport. So this would be really fascinating to see how this has changed compared to 2020. It may be at least another year before we get our hands on the data though. So on to the final question, what's happened in terms of road safety delivery? Well, quite early on, we were commissioned to carry out a report by Highways England East into the impacts on road safety in the eastern region. So this is the cover of a report that we've produced, and I'm going to take you through a few bits of the information that we compiled. So the review is formed of several parts. The first one, which was carried out in June, were interviews with representatives of different road safety partnerships in the east of England, which were then summarised in a discussion paper. So obviously telephone interviews, Zoom, Skype, the various different ways that we found of communicating with each other over lockdown. Then in September, there was a webinar, a series of presentations with a number of road safety representatives, even more, to discuss the paper and then to determine if the findings applied universally. And I think mostly they did. And then we've produced this final report which summarises the discussion paper and the webinar findings, and that's been distributed amongst all of the people in the east of England. We found it a fascinating exercise led by my colleague Tanya Fosdick. And it did identify some really good opportunities out there. People found that they had time to think about their road safety strategy, especially with this focus on cycling and walking. Made them think a little bit more about concepts such as Vision Zero, thinking about lower speeds on the road network as well, trying to increase reach through online tools, and that actually there was a greater public awareness of active travel, and obviously starting to see introduction of better cycling infrastructure during that period. There were some impacts, some changes, so some temporary or permanent budget restrictions. Obviously we don't know what's going to be happening in future years. Lots of events were cancelled. I'm surprised that's not close to 100%. People introducing online delivery, something that we've been doing a lot of work on for our school-based curriculums. Staff redeployed, mostly temporarily, people towards COVID-19 preparedness, and even people now I'm hearing being transferred onto track and trace. And then people having the opportunity to revise their strategy documents. So in terms of online education, only 16% of people saying that they're not interested in delivering that. So quite a number of people, just about a third, are already doing online delivery, but we can see half of all the respondents there saying that's something that they're planning to do. There really is going to be a big shift towards online delivery, I think, especially as we learn to live in this COVID era. There were some planned reductions that people are seeing for the future, so work-related road safety knocked back a bit. Public events for road user groups, in-person school education, they're the three highest categories, and that's really not a great surprise. And people looking at how they can turn those into online tools. So the conclusions from that exercise that we did was that yes, there were significant challenges, but that people have been really flexible and they've managed to change how they carry out their delivery. There's been some really positive attitudes towards partnership and regional working, talking about sharing resources, maybe even pooling some funding. That would be great to see people do that when they're generating these new resources. But I think it's also made people think, they need to understand hard to reach groups. How are they going to contact these people? And if you can't get them through your normal events, how are you going to speak to those? One thing that was also really positive, talking about a lot of this online delivery, but people also questioning it and said, well, how can we evaluate whether it's worked? Can we measure how many people took the course? Is there any kind of testing within there to see whether the knowledge that we've passed on is something that they're picking up? Really good to have those kinds of conversations with people. But then also recognising, once again, if it's not already happening, that this link in with active travel needs to be something that continues. So what is the impact of COVID-19 on road safety? Well, if we're going to be in this era where we're wearing masks for the significant future, it's probably going to change people's attitudes towards risk. We have lots of people suddenly very concerned about their personal health. Is this going to knock on into other health environments? Road safety is a public health message. We work in public health. It is a safety message. A lot of the issues that have been raised, certainly around cycling and walking and changes in people's behaviour, are absolutely relevant to us. And it could be that over the next year that people are going to be more interested in accepting change. Are people going to be more accepting of changes in speed limits, for example, changes in road priority for cycling and walking? These kinds of things that have often been really dogged down in political debate at a local level. It might be that we can introduce many more of these things that we think will help people's well-being and of course improve their safety. Okay, thank you for listening. I hope you found this informative, and hopefully see you again at next year's event. Goodbye.